Welcome to For Your Formation. I'm Anna Rachel Bolch, a spiritual formation writer and teacher dedicated to helping you keep life with God simple, never shallow. On For Your Formation, we'll let thoughtfulness and curiosity lead the way toward Christ-likeness. Through everyday spiritual formation, we'll discover more freedom and joy together. Y'all, I cannot tell you enough how excited I am for today's conversation with my friend, Brandy Wallner. You are absolutely going to love her, okay? When I think of someone who really embodies this notion of letting thoughtfulness and curiosity lead the way, I think of Brandy. I mean, really, truly. Her essay on Substack is called Curious Compassion. So, I mean, hello, this is perfect. So we're talking today about practicing compassion in particular. Her wisdom in this episode is just so good and so helpful. And y'all, it was really convicting to me. So I hope that you will learn something from this episode and from Brandy. And I definitely hope that you will go and follow her everywhere. I've left links down below in the description for you of everywhere to go and follow her. Some things that you need to know about Brandy. So Brandy is a lifelong creative writer who currently writes on the topic of compassion and is on a mission to love better. Brandy also serves on the board of directors for the Restoration Project in Southern California. I believe it's near the Port of Los Angeles. I'll make sure to link to the Restoration Project's website down below as well so that you can check that out. Y'all, I'm going to leave a link in the description down below for Brandy's Substack. It is called Curious Compassion, which is really the base of this episode and where our conversation came from. I really hope that you'll go and follow her there. I just know that it's going to be a book one day. I just have a feeling, okay? Because Brandy is brilliant and a beautiful writer and is one of those people that just really makes me think about my life with God and with others. So listen into this episode. I hope that you enjoy it as much as I did. Well, Brandy, welcome to For Your Formation.
Hi, Anna Rachel. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm thrilled that you're here too and that I get to introduce some my people to you. I really do hope that they'll go and follow you, especially on Curious Compassion on Substack, because I just get so much out of them. I mean, talk about thoughtfulness and curiosity leading the way toward Christ-likeness. I think that's what the goal is here on For Your Formation, but I really do think that that's what you do with your writing in Curious Compassion. So I'm just thrilled. I'm just absolutely thrilled that you're here. I can't say it enough. Well, let's just jump right in. I'm thinking about this episode really being about practicing compassion. And growing up in church, I think I had a certain idea in my head of what compassion was. But I would love to know what your definition of compassion is, because it might be different from what I maybe learned and what some other people who are listening may have learned.
Yeah, I think we all learned the same thing. And I think when we talk about compassion, we probably all have the same sort of mental picture in our minds, right? I think we think of like Mother Teresa and people like that who are just sort of these icons of doing good in the world. And I think for me, it is absolutely that, of course. But I think that there are kind of smaller ways that we can act compassionately towards each other that actually make such a big impact in ways that we, maybe don't think of. And so one of the things that helped me to start kind of thinking through this sort of definition of compassion is it comes from the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research. And I'm just going to read it to you here. And they talk about the root of the word compassion, right? They say, okay, so passio means to suffer. Right. So when we think of like Passion Week, when we think of Jesus, we think of that passion and suffering for us. And so that's where the root of passio. And then also com, meaning with or together. So to suffer with is the literal meaning of the word compassion. Right. And sign me up, right? Suffer with. Sign me up.
Yeah, I'm totally into that.
Yeah, none of us want to do that, but I think it's bigger than that. And so kind of the definition that I've come up with is a recognition and a practice of our communal need for each other. And when I say that, it's not just how do I enter into serve someone, but how can I be with someone, whether or not they are in a place of suffering, really, or maybe just with someone when I'm having a conflict, right? So things like conflict are separators often for us as humans. So think about like the last fight, I maybe had with my husband or you had with yours. Like it's conflict separates, but when
Mhm.
we can put ourselves in this posture of withness, um, that really recognizes how I think God intended us for us to be. Right? We see withness in Scripture throughout. We see the everlasting relationship of the Trinity, right? Father, Son, Holy Spirit, lasting in withness together. We see God walking with Adam and Eve in the garden with them in the cool of the day. Over and over, there are these examples of withness and our need for each other.
Say the definition just one more time, just the definition part,
Yeah,
because I want to focus
yeah.
on part of it.
So for me, compassion is the recognition and practice of our communal need for one another.
Oh, okay. That's so good. I'm gonna like have to have it quilted or something, like in a like needle pointed on a pillow. I don't know, or hanging in my office
That's
somewhere
awesome.
because I think that when I think of compassion and what I kind of grew up, I think believing about compassion, it definitely had to do with action. It had to
Mhm.
do with doing something like that. Compassion was almost an extension of empathy, that it
Yes.
wasn't enough to be empathetic, but that you had to take some sort of action with that
Mhm.
empathy. But I like that you include this about one, it being a practice. Yes, please. All about that over
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
And because I don't think it's something that we're perfect at. I mean,
No, not at
not
all.
at
Not at all.
all. And I
Yeah.
think that this idea of withness encompasses so much more than service, just serving one another, which was
Mhm.
always the context that I saw it in. And, I would say that most of us Christians, we know that compassion should be part of our life of faith.
Yeah.
But I'm really curious when that became real for you. Like, when did you
Yeah.
realize, oh, compassion is something I need to practice in my life of faith?
That's a great question. And I love what you said a moment ago about it not being, it doesn't come naturally. At least it doesn't come
No.
naturally to me. And for most people, I don't think it does. I mean, you certainly, you and I probably know people, we both know people who seem to live in this outward posture of service, right? And it maybe seems to come more natural to those people. But I also think that, like you said, it has to become a practice for us. For me personally, it wasn't an epiphany. Like I didn't suddenly wake up one morning and think to myself, "Gosh, you know what? I need to be more compassionate." It was rather this sort of slow knowing,
Mm,
in that coming to realize more and more of myself and understand more and more of myself over the past few years. Um, I've always been someone who sort of I avoid drama and mess at all costs.
yeah.
I am a hardcore card carrying introvert and I really love my solitude. Like I'm someone who, give me coffee and a good book or a glass of wine at the end of the night and I'm a happy girl. I want to avoid the messes. But what I have slowly come to realize is part of that avoidance was me feeling as if I had to show up in a certain way. I had to go and be cheerful and be my best self when trying to serve someone who may be in a place of suffering, right? So the job is to go and be joyful and rejoice in all things and all of those good things that we hear. But at the end of the day, like we are humans. And I think what has slowly been impressed upon me is that I get to show up naturally. If the goal is unity, right, and the goal, if God designed us to be in communion with one another, then we have to be able to show up as our natural selves. That means opening my home when it's not perfect. That means showing up to sit with someone else when I've got my own mess going on, but just being there and allowing the Lord to use us in however he plans on using us. Sometimes it's not about pulling someone out of their sadness or their grief. Sometimes it's just sitting in the dirt with them, right? Like
Yeah.
we look at examples like Job in scripture where his friends came along and they kind of just made things worse for a while.
Absolutely.
And, they kind of made things so much worse. But in just sitting with him, right? And just being in the grief with him, that's a powerful thing. And so that sort of slow understanding of I don't have to show up perfectly, and neither do you, for us to be together and be in this recognition of our need for each other. So show up honestly, I think, is the slow sort of knowing that has dawned on me. And then the other piece of it is, and this has been a harder sort of recognition, but God is so kind in that just showing me my tendency towards judgment.
Mm.
I can be really judgmental of people. And, I hate to admit it, but we all struggle with that on probably some level. But I think judgment keeps us separate. It keeps us separate and not connected in the ways that we could be to one another. Um, and that keeps us from showing up too, right? If I've got this sort of preconceived idea of, someone, and I'm not allowing it to build any sort of connection between us. Like we're more alike than we think most of the time.
Well, I'm having serious flashbacks to like mission trips as a teenager, where
Mm.
like something you said earlier about show up and be joyful and show up and be, I mean, in our case, it was often, you're here to be a representative of Christ, of our
Mm-hmm.
church, of our community, of your parents, of, us as like your leaders.
Everyone. That's a whole lot
Yeah.
of
It's a
whole lot
whole
on your
lot.
shoulders.
Right. In some ways I can understand, like, teenagers, they're hard. And a lot of times they do come in kind of with the attitude sometimes about certain things. But I mean, I was rarely told to show up authentically as myself. It was so much of show up this way because you represent God or you're representing Christ,
Mm.
you're representing these people. And it was so little about how I already am, and that who I am in Christ and the way that God is transforming me is already worthy and good enough. And that's actually the thing that
Yes.
connects people, rather than me putting up some sort of front that I'm always joyful or that I'm always
Yes.
just delighting, or that I am totally happy and
Yes.
nothing has gone wrong.
You're speaking
Many
to
of the
me. I
things.
mean, as an Enneagram 1, I want to show up everywhere as this idealized perfect version of myself.
Yes.
And she just doesn't exist, folks. Like she just doesn't exist. So
So
I
sad.
think like it's so sad, right? She just doesn't. But that idea of ourselves can just keep us
Mhm.
away from each other.
Yeah, totally. Also, I love what you said about judgment too, and that it's the thing that separates us. I mean, yeah, I think you spoke about your Enneagram oneness. I'm an Enneagram 9, but gosh, when that one wing comes out, I mean, like I want to
Yes.
do things, I want to do things perfectly, and also I can see that what you're doing is wrong, and I want to correct you, and all of those sorts of
Yes.
things. And it's hard
Yes.
when we're learning about compassion and we're trying to practice compassion. Gosh, that really is something that can get in the way. Which, speaking
Mm-hmm.
of things that get in the
Hmm.
way, in your essays you do sometimes mention something called compassion
Hmm.
blockers, or these
Yeah.
mindsets that keep us from being compassionate. So would you share a couple of those with us and how we can get out of that mindset?
Yes. So you actually, we were touching on it in the last question that you asked, and we talked a little bit about judgment. So judgment is a particularly, I would say, insidious one in that I think that we, especially as Christians, um, can think very in black and white terms.
Totally.
And we can decide that someone is wrong and these things to do are wrong and these things to do are right. And so we often, if we're not careful, can put ourselves in the place of God, and sit in judgment of one another. And I think what it does, there's a concept in psychology that's called fundamental attribution error, and it talks about
Mm.
how we sort of we paint ourselves with a lot of nuance, a lot of color. Like we are acting the way that we're acting or behaving the way that we're behaving because any number of wonderful excuses versus when someone else maybe wrongs us, we immediately sort of lean more towards like deep character flaws instead of
Mm.
them also having valid reasons as to why they've done what they've done. And so I think that, we can all fall into that trap. And if we aren't careful, that judgment definitely creates this sort of separation instead of creating space for witness for our souls, for that unity of soul. Instead of us saying, I'm with you in this, we're immediately against someone.
I really love that, and I just wanna touch on it really quickly that I love what you're
Mhm.
saying about I can't remember, of course, the psychological term now, but
Mm.
but this idea that us, when we look at ourselves, we see ourselves as complex human beings. We see the
Mhm.
complexity of ourselves, we know our nuances, all of the ways that we are different, and, in some ways, we may even see ourselves as important, or sometimes we see ourselves as unimportant, and that influences the way that we live and act in the world, but that we have such a hard time placing those types of things on other people and knowing that, hey, they have their own inner life too that is influencing the way that
Mhm.
they're acting and being. And even for someone like me, who I really do think of myself as a very, I mean, Enneagram 9, I've already said it, but I find it pretty easy to put myself in other people's shoes and other people's
Mhm.
perspectives. But
Mhm.
I still do find myself struggling with this sometimes. And I keep coming back to memories from high school, from college, from, other points in my life when I maybe walked into a situation or walked into a room having some sort of preconceived idea about this person that I'm interacting with and how they're
Mhm.
going to act and those sorts of things. And that it's only when I get to know them and get to be with them in a multitude of circumstances, and when I'm kind of keeping my mouth shut when I'm doing it,
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
that's when I get to learn, oh, they're not the type of person I thought they were. Or, they're not
Yeah.
they have this whole complexity to them that I couldn't see because I just am not taking the time to practice being with them. And I find that I
Mm.
just so often change my mind about people, not that I feel like I'm going around judging people constantly or anything, but
Right.
that there have been so many circumstances in my life when maybe my faith looked a lot smaller than it does now. My faith maybe wasn't as
Mhm.
expansive as I think it is now. But just at those times, those people helped me to expand my faith. They're the ones who helped me see that, gosh, the table of God is so much longer and wider and richer than I thought it could be. And
Yes.
we miss out on all of that goodness when we have that compassion blocker of judgment, for sure.
Yeah, 100%. I love everything you're saying. I have also just misjudged or prejudged people, and later, I think of friends that I have now that maybe when I
Yeah.
first met them or first encountered them, I was like, I don't know. And then, years later, we're great friends. And it's, wow, God, like
Yeah.
you're capable of really blowing our minds when we
Yes.
allow ourselves to stay open and decide to engage with people who, again, I think often we have far more commonalities than we think that we do.
Totally, totally. Well, what's one of your
Yeah.
other compassion blockers that you wanted
Yeah.
to talk about with us?
Yeah. The other is scarcity.
Mm.
And this one starts really early, right?
Yeah.
We enter life with this sort of not enoughness, and we we can't share our toys. We can't share our room. It starts as children. And as adults, like it honestly, it just sort of morphs into other ways. And, maybe we're not as concerned about toys, but, I think that we can live from this place of lack, and that always will impact our behavior if we're living from that place of lacking something, right? We become hoarders of stuff, we become hoarders of time. We can lash out at people if we feel as if we're being infringed upon in some way. I think on a small scale, on like a micro scale, scarcity can turn us into people who, people who will trample over someone to get a television on Black Friday, right? Like
Right.
that's scarcity on like the small scale. Scarcity on a larger scale is we don't pay our employees enough. We have built entire systems that keep people in systems of oppression, right? Because we originally perhaps didn't have the resources or the time or the money. And so these eras and decades of people feeling as if they will not be provided for, right? And what we know as Christians is that God God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Like he is more than willing to provide for our needs, but it's very difficult for us to live like that, right? And so I think when we are living from that place of lack or scarcity, it creates this rift between us and other people because we're just afraid to give up what we have. And what we have could simply just be time, right? We hang on to our time. We decide, we're not going to volunteer. We're not going to any of those sorts of traditional sort of ways of compassion, or even things like relational compassion, where we are offering compassion to like a friend that we have who we know is in need. But instead, like, I'm really tired and I'm not sure that I have enough to give. So I'm going to hold on to the time that I have. So anytime that we live like not from abundance, but from lack, I think
Yeah.
it's really detrimental to our ability to be compassionate.
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm so glad that you said that at the end about living from a place of abundance rather than lack. Because as you were talking, I just kept thinking, oh, that's convicting. Like, I am not the
Mm,
kind of person who wants to give my time. I think maybe it does
same.
have something to do with this. Well, okay, good. I'm glad I'm not alone. Because I I just keep thinking about how I do spend my time. Like, I think I'm good in terms of I I don't keep a lot of things. Like on this micro scale that you're talking about of like
Mhm, mhm.
I really do try to practice simplicity in my life in a very tangible way that I don't want my house to be cluttered with things that I know someone else could use and love and
Mm,
enjoy
mhm.
when it's not something I use or love or enjoy. Um,
Yeah.
but I also think I'm not, which I know we'll talk about in the Patreon episode in particular about
Mhm.
outward self-care.
Yeah.
But I want to touch on here that, like we said earlier, you and I, we're both very introverted people. I love
Mhm.
being by myself. And even though, I mean, even though I
Yep.
work from home, even though my husband works from home, even though we do that, we get tons of alone time. But even then, I sense this lack in my own life of community and
Mm,
of witness. Um, and it comes from that scarcity mindset of feeling
yeah.
like, oh, if I give this piece of me, this piece of time, this piece
Mhm.
of expertise or whatever it is away, then it's gone. And
Mhm, mhm.
whereas I love what you're saying of no, we have an abundance in God and we can trust in that.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. You know that I love alone time. I work from home as well. And I think we, especially now, like this post-COVID era that we're in, so many of us are either working from home or just have found and explored more things that we sort of like to do on our own, by
Yes.
necessity originally. And now I think people are just far more interested in those sort of solitary pursuits. But just again, coming back to that recognition that our communal need for each other is, it's important. God created us for unity.
I'm just wondering, what's something you're thinking about lately when it comes to compassion and practicing compassion in your life and remaining curious about it?
Yeah, so much. I think I have, and I've asked this question of my Substack community. I asked recently, like, what are some of the blockers you see, those compassion blockers? And I got a couple of actually really interesting answers this morning. And one of them was materialism, and the other was comparison. And comparison for me feels very, very linked to judgment,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
from the side of not necessarily seeing people as so judgment tends to lend itself more towards like othering someone else and
Yes.
saying they are not like me, or they're not even they're not up to my standard, right? Like there's something there, whereas comparison sort of finds the lack in us, I think.
Yeah.
And so then the separation might then be, well, I'm not up to the challenge. I'm not up to putting myself out there because there's something inherently wrong with me. And I think that that's something interesting to explore, is sort of like how we feel about ourselves. And if we have feelings of just not being good enough, then I think that that might also lend itself to not being able to be in union with people, which again is that root of compassion, right?
Yeah.
And then that materialism, I started to think, well, again, it's very linked to scarcity. So there seem to be these sort of broad categories that have a lot of offshoots
Yeah.
of ways that they might block us from further uniting with each other.
Definitely. Okay. Yes, that's very interesting. And I trust that you're gonna write about it sometime soon because I want to read that.
Yes,
Okay.
definitely will. Definitely will.
Yay. Yay. Well, I am so, so grateful for this conversation and helping us just think through more about what it looks like to practice compassion in our lives and what that actually means for us. And I hope that those of you who are listening or watching, that you are maybe like me and are thinking about compassion in a different way now, and that this is something that we can continue to reflect on and explore together. And Brandy, I'm just so glad that we're in this together, that we get to be friends and are, talking about this and having these conversations offline as well. And I hope that anyone who's listening or watching has those people in their lives too, that they can talk about this subject and can practice being with one another in that. So I'm just extra grateful for you, Brandy. Thank you so, so much for being here.
This has been really, really great. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I love that we're getting to talk about it, like you said, in a different way, because I think that it means more than we maybe think it means.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so, so much. I absolutely love and adore Brandy. I am still going to be thinking about this conversation for days, weeks, maybe months to come after this. And I'm so glad that I am following her on Substack so that I get to see more of her thoughts about compassion and what it means to live a compassionate life with Christ. So be sure to follow her all the places. I've got all the links down for you below: her Substack, her Instagram, the Restoration Project. All of those things are linked for you below. And be sure to subscribe to this podcast in your favorite podcast app and on YouTube so that you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. Now, here's to keeping life with God simple, never shallow. Oh, I got so much going on in front of me. Ugh. Also serves on the board of directors for the Resurrection. That's not it. It's not the Resurrection Project. That's something different, I'm sure. People don't tell you, like, especially when you're doing a video podcast, people do not tell you how much stuff you have to have, like, up in front of you. Let me adjust my hair. I mean, not that I can see myself anyway, but I'm just going to trust.
You look lovely. You look lovely.
Thank you. You do too. I gotta sneeze. I can feel it. I can totally feel it. I got it.